Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
Chapter 8, excerpted from the Therapy Journals of Madison Gray Kilroy, age 22. For 13 years, I had nightmares about them coming to me. Often they were worse than nightmares. I would wake up and see a shadow, huge, misshapen, and towering, lurking in the frame of my bedroom door, watching me sleep. I would close my eyes and hope that it went away, or that my vision would refocus if I squeezed my eyes and waited for my mind to sweep out of the fog of sleep. But every time I peered from the sheets, I could still see the black hulk of a headless man filling the doorframe. Other times, the dreams were surreal, especially as I grew older. When I was 16, I found myself in a rocky valley at the foot of a cliff face. The sky was dark with scudding clouds, and the wind moaned softly in the trees around her. Swaying back and forth, the snow began falling down around me. Something about the rock wall was revolting to me, like the smell of death, and I found myself staring expectantly at a cleft in its base. Something was inside it, something still and lifeless, and I longed to be returned to my bed. But somehow, I knew that I must look, and that I was meant to meet whatever it was that seemed so thin and cold inside the rock. I moved forward, hoping that everything would fade away, but the closer I got, the more I could tell that it was a woman, and that it was dead. I would walk up to within a few feet of it. My eyes would well with frightened tears as I waited for the white hand to stir. But one look at the strange purple fingers and the bloodless white arm told me that I must reach out and turn it over if I wanted to see its horrible face. But I thought I knew, somewhere inside of me, what I would see, and I would throw my hands over my eyes and scream. I dreamed this several times, but I could never bring myself to turn the body over, much less touch it, much less to stare into its cold eyes. Sometimes I would be running as fast as I could down a forest path alongside a river at night. I was trying to reach something or place that I knew would bring me back to my bed, but I never knew where or what it was, and I had no idea whether I was getting closer or even running in the right direction. It was always late at night, and the sky was deep, velvet purple, and the moon rising in the clouds behind me in an amber haze. I would glance behind me and see the man gliding behind me, with his feet hovering above the ground. He was tall with long, willowy limbs, and his face hidden in shadow. But the moonlight coming behind him would glow in his hair, and I could faintly make out the deep shadow of his deep-set eyes against what appeared to be a pale face mottled by dark warts or rotten sores of some kind. I would suddenly reach a bend in the road where a long wooden bridge crossed the river at a point where the opposite bank sloped down to the broad, black water. I knew that I must cross this bridge to get away from the tall, thin man floating behind me, and I would leap for it and run as fast as I could. But before I was halfway across it, there would be a horrible, echoing thunder and a shrieking, whirring sound like the whine of mosquitoes, and I would feel intense heat all over my face as everything went black. The last sensation I would have was the sharp stabbing pain of his bony fingers grabbing me by both shoulders, digging his sharp nails into my flesh and dragging me to the ground with his weight. I had these dreams for 13 years, but the night before I left for college, I was 18. I had one last nightmare, and I haven't had any since. I was laying on the ground and I was slowly, sluggishly coming to my senses as if I'd been knocked unconscious. I opened my eyes and saw a rock formation looming over me like a waiting sepulchre. Molten moonlight splashed over its craggy surface. pooling quietly at its base. Soft flakes of snow were drifting through the trees and gleaming like sapphires. At first I tried to stand, but my head was still slushing with blood, and I only got as far as sitting up and leaning against one of the boulders. I looked down around me and I noticed that I was wearing clothes that weren't mine. Reaching up, I felt my hair was different, long and ginger-colored. Felt myself begin to panic at the thought of what I knew must happen next. How I must be pulled from the ground and dragged away into a black, limitless gulf. Just at this moment, a splashy tramp by the side of the rock caught my ear. I slowly turned to see him watching me from his saddle, with his light cavalry saber gleaming in the soft light of the moon. No, not watching. He was aware of me. I felt sure, but he was bent achingly over the pommel, his throat ending in a pulpy purple gash. Dark stains soaked his collar, which had been torn open in the blast, and down the front of his shirt. The exposed skin was the same marbled white as his hands which suddenly both reached out to me as the moon shone through his long nails. Chapter 9. Excerpted from a letter of Washington Irving to James Kirk Paulding, February 1813. I can still remember the weird romance we heard from the venerable old Pompey at Carl's Mill. The goblin haunt in the heart of the hollow, of the itinerant pedagogue who had the misfortune of courting a country coquette, and who was so unceremoniously expunged from the face of the earth the morning following his doomed application. There was apparently much talk in the town that he'd been spirited away by the roaming figure of a headless dragoon, a spectre which had already appeared to him twice and had much troubled his dreams. No word was ever heard from the poor varlet, and whether or not the wide-eyed suppositions of the Dutch wives hold any water, it had certainly been accepted as a canonical history, much honored at their firesides, and whispered over their spinning wheels. It has hardly been 30 years since the melancholy schoolmaster strolled upon the quiet hills of Sleepy Hollow, but the last time that I myself tarried in that witching part of the world, I was regaled by this legend with the same dreadful gravity and awe that one might expect to hear a Scotchman murmur of his witches, or a German speaking of the wild huntsman in hushed and pensive tones. Chapter 10. October 29th, mid-morning. The following morning, the professor of early American studies arranged a meeting with Mrs. Van Brunt, one of the curators of the Phillipsburg Manor, to authenticate the horseshoe. She was a little old woman whose thick glasses magnified her dust-colored eyes. The professor handed it over, and the curator eagerly fingered the shoe which had been freed of rust by being softly scoured with brass wool after soaking in mineral spirits overnight. Her eyes gleamed with interest as she held it under a desk lamp and rocked it slowly in the golden light. Certainly not steel. The scrubbed iron was still brown and barky with age. "It's definitely antebellum workmanship," the old woman sighed softly, turning the shoe over in her wrinkled hands. "Colonial?" "Possibly, quite possibly. Though I'd say no earlier than the 1760s. No later than, say, 1830. No calkins, no toe clip. Definitely antebellum. It's English work, though. American shoes don't have this kind of fullering. You see here. The shape is definitely more along the lines of an army farrier than what you'd see from a village blacksmith." Tracing these details with the tip of her pinky, she turned it around for her guests to see. The professor of early American studies glowed with satisfaction. She saw her chances for tenure, for clinging that much longer to the stability and the advancement that her soul starved for, within grasp. A publication verifying the original location of a literary icon like this was sure to attract her chair's good favor. Her eyes sparkled, a smoldering dark brown that burned like a tree scorched by lightning. Suddenly the old woman glanced up sharply, looking through the window at something standing under the tree outside the museum doors. The professor was still poring over the shoe and didn't notice the worry in the curator's wrinkled face. before she looked away from whatever it was and turned back to her guest. "You're looking for the Colonial Bridge, then?" Yes. I didn't say that, did I?" "No," she said in a low, slow tone. "No, I just had a hunch. You're working by yourself?" "Yeah, it won't take more than one person to do the work I'm planning, and if this shoe is any indication, I may be pretty close." "How far upriver are you?" 200 meters up from the bridge." "The modern bridge?" "Yeah." "And when are you doing this?" The professor of early American studies suddenly felt a wave of irritation stirring inside her. "Any time that there's enough daylight," she replied stonily. I see, Mrs. Van Brunt murmured, watching something over the younger woman's shoulder. The professor turned to look at the window behind her, but was distracted by the curator's next words. "Be very careful not to be in that place alone after dark." She looked back at the old woman curiously. But there was nothing more that needed to be said, apparently. The old woman handed the shoe back and didn't make eye contact. "Is there any particular reason why?" "The rocks are slippery with moss by the river, and the Pocantico is a dangerous place to be by yourself at any time of day." She sighed in exasperation. "Late 18th century, though. Late 18th century. Probably made by an army smith. I've seen others like it dug up in excavations on Chatterton's Hill. The British 17th Light Dragoons and the Hessian Jaeger Corps were deployed there at the Battle of White Plains." "Thank you." The professor of early American studies hurried outside to return to the riverbed and continue her work. But the old curator's eyes trembled behind her fishbowl lenses. She didn't like the pockmarked face or the smooth, gliding movements of the tall, thin man in black who had been watching them from the shadows of the ash tree outside, and who was now following the scholar from a distance. Chapter 11. Excerpted from a letter in the New York Public Library Archives collection of Van Cortlandt family papers. Sirs, reports of a very heated action held yesterday morning on the Albany Post Road by the Old Dutch Church in Tarrytown. An alarum was raised by the Committee of Public Safety in Yonkers, and a rider sent to alert the Post Road Watch. Captain Martling, along with 6 men of the 3rd Westchester Regiment, were at that time keeping the watch from Redoubt overlooking the bridge. When the messenger aroused them with the intelligence that committee members had decried a mounted party of some 30 Tories and Hessians making high speed up the road under the morning darkness, it is surmised that they had designs of taking and fortifying the church there in preparation for a landing party as a frigate. The notorious Roebuck was sighted off the Sing Sing that same morning. Captain Martling proposed that the raiders were to have signaled their success by the ringing of the church bell, thereby prompting the Roebuck to issue a party of Marines on shore. Martling prepared to make a stand from the breastworks on the hill overlooking the brook there, having so few men under arms, and no ammunition for the Redoubt's only gun, a 3 PDR field piece. He saw fit to send the rider to rouse a company of Connecticut privateers, whose sloop, the Spider, was anchored at the Tarrytown docks. The rider returned with 17 sailors and 5 Continental Marines, under Captain Erasmus Craven of Mystic Harbor, who brought with them the grape and canister artillery rounds from their vessel. By the time the privateers arrived at the hill under the church, a fierce action was already underway, and the Tory riders had made their way across the bridge and were attempting a flanking maneuver against the Fort Captain Craven to have the gun loaded and personally discharged it into the raiding party, which successfully repelled them back across the bridge. Dawn was coming at this time, and the sound of the gun had alerted the locals to the battle taking place in the neighborhood. The leader of the raiders, a Tory major named Samuels, was killed in the first volley, and his lieutenant, a young German, led a second assault on the works by making fast on the bridge with pistols and sabers drawn. Captain Craven waited until the troopers had approached the bridge and fired a round of grape at them, just as they clambered onto the boards. The grape broke their charge and left 5 of the Germans and 2 of the horses dead on the bridge. 9 of the enemy were wounded and 6 were captured. 2 of these later died of their wounds. Captain Martling reports 3 of his men wounded in this action, and 1 of the Connecticut soldiers was shot through the head. Captain Craven is to be commended for his uncommonly ferocious gallantry in coming to the defense of the town. I remain your most devoted servant. Signed, Colonel Pierre Van Cortlandt, Commandant 3rd, Westchester Regiment of Militia, White Plains. Chapter 12, October 29th, dusk. After an entire day of rooting around the site of the discovery, the professor of early American studies was sure that she had found the lost site of the Colonial Bridge. Admittedly, there had been many as 3 different spans erected over his general area before the road was straightened out into its current configuration. But there was unquestionably evidence of some pre-industrial workmanship at the bend in the river under the blasted oak tree. So far, she had uncovered what appeared to be the online of a crude foundation on the eastern side of the river, and, with the help of a rented metal detector, had located 9 rust-choked iron spikes resting in 2 parallel lines along the bed of the brook. Signs of a bridge which had been abandoned to rot, fall, sink, and disintegrate into the river. She took thorough notes, pictures, and samples before turning in for the night to translate her shorthand into academic prose. As she walked down her host's quiet street, she found herself glancing back and forth, noticing the decorations in the yard. Skeletons, bony limbs jutting out from the grass, foam headstones with cheeky epitaphs, gauze ghosts bobbing from the trees. She noticed the amber grin of jack-o'-lanterns beaming at her from deep purple shadows on their porches. She watched the warm golden windows where families could be seen moving back and forth with muffled conversation leaking out of the glass. One group, late to the trend, was bent around their freshly bought pumpkins, cutting eyes and noses out of the tawny skin, while another was shouting and jumping over some kind of board game. She sensed the liquid warmth pouring from these encased portals. She felt the vibrations of connections and community and belonging. Although part of her smarted with a faint burn of jealousy, she mostly watched them with the same appreciative detachment that you might feel examining masterpieces in a museum. She saw them, recognized their value, and passed on without feeling any claim to their universes. But somehow, she didn't feel the gravity of the orbit she was being pulled into. Somehow she wasn't aware of the tides pulling her out to sea, nor did she sense the subtle approach of danger all around her, tightening its perimeter, like a pack of wolves encircling a campsite, their eyes glinting in the dying embers of the sleeper's campfire. As she climbed the steps up to her room, she thought for a moment that she saw someone, standing, watching her from behind a lamppost, from the corner of her eye. She thought she saw a mop of red hair, flaming orange in the electric beam, spilling down the front and sides of a mottled bluish face, whose eyes were hidden in their shadowy sockets. But on closer look, it was a scarecrow decoration tied to the pole. She walked up the stairs, unlocked the door, and stepped into the black room. Red light glowed from the single transom window, an eye-like half-circle directly across from the street lamp. She was oddly relieved to turn the light on and find nothing waiting for her. She wasn't sure what she expected, but the instinctive relief unsettled her. After 3 hours of arranging her research with academic rigor, she found herself leaning back onto the pillows and closing her eyes for a few seconds of thoughtlessness. Just a moment without self-control. A quick break for the tension that had been holding everything together for days, months, years. In the strange purple vapors that veiled her eyes, she saw a room swathed in darkness except for a transom window that glowed like a watchful red eye. The dusky light brushed the surfaces of the walls and furniture in reddish umber, a twilight sepia that vaguely revealed the outlines of its barely hinted-at contents. Here was a hazy band of dark reddish-brown that must be part of a wall. There was an absolutely opaque rectangle in it, as impenetrable as black velvet. It must be a doorway. She watched it closely, knowing that it had something to show her, that something must enter by it. At first, she thought she saw something stirring in the blackness. Shadows, breeding shadows. Subtle movements like peering down into a pit at night, and realizing that it is carpeted in snakes, quietly churning in an undulating pool. But then the movements grew less, and something was slowly coming forward. No, it was already there. Maybe it had been there all along. It was human in shape, but somehow huge, misshapen, and towering. In the dull crimson light, she could detect a shoulder and an arm inside a coat, with an upturned cuff glinting with 2 large buttons on one side. The cuff ended in a pale mottled hand with cadaverous fingers. The light glowed through the long nails at their ends. The head was swallowed in shadow. No, it simply wasn't there. She could see the savage purple wound on the tattered neck. Charred, marble-sized punctures indented the bare throat, some coming as low as the collarbone, as if the injury had been created by a gigantic shotgun, eating the head away in a spray of searing lead balls. Her entire body prickled, but with a strange foreign emotion, a sort of prepared anticipation, as if she understood what had to happen and was ready for it. She slid off the bed and took a step towards the door. The figure in the shadows didn't move. She took another step out of sheer curiosity. She had to know who he was and what he wanted and how she could help. The third step came slower. She now realized that even without a head, the figure loomed powerfully over her, and she could detect a commanding wide-chested frame beneath the sun-faded green jacket. But was she ready? Eager, even, for what had to happen next? Was she? Should she be? Was something invading her mind and overwhelming her reason? Something deep inside fought back like a caged dog in a flooding basement.
Awaken.
It seemed to moan from somewhere in the base of her skull. The fingers on the bony hand, outlined grotesquely in shrunken white skin, blotted at the palms and fingertips in inky purple, suddenly stirred like a waking spider, reaching out spastically towards her as the legs bounded from the shadows and the clatter of its boot heels dashed her out of sleep. She bolted up in bed. Her head swam with blood as her heart stomped between her ribs. Nothing else was in the room with her. She was sure of it. But the dreams had unsettled her, and she spent the rest of the night watching the door, and entirely unsure whether she was hoping or dreading that she would recognize his silhouette watching back from the murk. Chapter 13. Excerpted from The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. The revenue arising from his school was small, and would have been scarcely sufficient to furnish him with daily bread, for he was a huge feeder, and through lank, had the dilating powers of an anaconda. His appetite for the marvelous and his powers of digesting it were equally extraordinary, and both had been increased by his residence in this spellbound region. No tale was too gross or monstrous for his capacious swallow. October 30th, early morning before dawn. She woke up well before dawn and quickly dressed to explore the woods at Raven Rock in the heart of the Rockefeller State Nature Preserve. She had never been there, and although she had finished her research on the legendary woman in white, she thought that a personal visit to the site could possibly be useful. She wanted to go as early as possible, however, so she could get back to exploring the river before 9 o'clock. 1/2 hour was probably all she needed, and while the eastern horizon was still an ashy gray, she set out to catch a glimpse of a famous rock formation before moving on to more pressing matters. She went to unlock the door, but her plans were momentarily disrupted by 2 unnerving discoveries. Firstly, the door, which she had locked every night, was ajar, letting in the clammy morning air and swaying limply in the draft. Secondly, the horseshoe, which she was positive she had packed away in a Ziploc bag, was laying on the threshold, preventing the door from closing. Apparently she was sleepwalking. It wasn't very surprising considering the stress she was under to finish her paper and keep tenure within her grasp. The fact that she had opened the door, though, left her unsettled. She could have broken her neck tripping down the stairs. She decided to put a chair in front of the doorway before she went to bed that night and left the apartment in a rush. There are 3 stories about the shrieking ghost that haunts Raven Rock. The bleakest describes a young widow collecting firewood who was caught in a blizzard during the worst winter Sleepy Hollow ever knew. Driven to find shelter by the whipping sleet, she huddled in the flinty abscess of the rock and waited for the warm morning which never came in her lifetime. Another tells of a beautiful Delaware maiden who was chased into the rushing snow by a lustful warrior bound to avenge himself on her body. Instead, she threw herself from the top of the monolith onto the ice and stones below, preferring the freedom of death to slavery. The third comes from the Revolutionary era and tells of a teenage girl from a patriotic Whig family who fell in love with an enemy soldier during the spring of 1777. After Washington's Continentals had been driven from White Plains and across the Hudson. With Westchester now being fought over by ruthless bandits, the Patriot-aligned Skinners and the Tory Cowboys, the young woman found protection in the arms of a lieutenant in the Crown Forces, who had helped free her father's cart from the mud after a summer shower. He courted her in secret, away from her family's eyes, and they met in the shadow of the thickets and grapevines on the western bank of the Pocantico, not far from the old church bridge. They fell in love and became inseparable, but her frequent absences aroused her mother's suspicions, and when her secret was discovered, she was thrown out of her house without a single possession. She sent a letter across enemy lines asking her lover to meet her at Raven Rock where they could examine their options and decide on a future. Perhaps she would leave with him for the British camp in New York. Perhaps he would leave with her for the American camp in Albany. Perhaps they would leave everything behind and create a new world together in the fertile frontier. But it was not to be. The messenger was shot by a sentry, the message lost, and what began as a mild, misty day in the winter of '78 suddenly whipped into a cataclysmic snowstorm. She waited for him in the satin wedding dress that she had saved for him, and as the sleet drove her back towards the rock, she laid down in an effort to conserve her draining body heat, wondering when he would ride up and take her away, north to Albany, south to Manhattan, or west to a new life in the frontier. She may have been imagining this future when she drifted off to a black sleep. She was found later that week by a patrol of dragoons frozen to the ground and encased in ice that matched the white of her dress and bloodless face. She has ever since haunted the rock with her screeching wail, a terrible indictment for her absentee lover. When snowstorms brew over the Hudson. Raven Rock is located in a particularly quiet part of the nature preserve called Buttermilk Hill. During the Revolution, locals would hide their cattle in its shadow when cowboys were spotted on the prowl, giving the slope its bovine name. Even today, however, Buttermilk Hill is an unsuitably pleasant name for this shadowy glen, and everyone refers to it by the name of its monstrous monolith. It is the largest glacial erratic in the country, a 600-million-year-old relic of the icy juggernauts that carved their way down the Hudson Valley, strewing the wild landscapes with cyclopean debris. The formation still has an unnerving magnetic influence on travelers who are often unaccountably disturbed by its immense size and strange, house-like dimensions. It is not an irregular pile of boulders or a sloping promontory, but a flinty non sequitur, a black block of craggy granite, rising like a gloomy manor house out of the maples surrounding it. Even today, the funeral silence around it is only broken by the strangled croaks of the namesake ravens who nest along its flat top. Massive scavengers who glower defensively at hikers from these perches, only leaving their posts when they detect the stench of death wafting in from a carcass in the woods. Its face is large and sharp, but there are several clefts in its base where a desperate woman might attempt to find shelter. One suspiciously coffin-shaped den has been closely connected to the story of the woman in white and is often cited as the identical place where her body was found frozen in her stony shelter. Whether she was a luckless mother, a desperate victim, or an abandoned lover, there is an unquestionably feminine energy stirring at its base and watching from its heights. Hikers sometimes smell a rustic perfume like sweet musk and lavender near its foot, or catch a fleeting glimpse of a huddled thing in white with its back to them. Some have felt a warm breath on the back of their ear, as if someone was about to whisper a secret to them, or have felt fingertips trailing down their spine in a strangely intimate way. Few people visit Raven Rock without their minds being clouded by a strange depression, and several suicides have been reported there since the 1920s. It seems to stew with anger, bitter atmosphere that weighs on the minds of those who see it. It has some power over the mind that infects the imagination with bizarre nightmares and unsettling forebodings. She has been to Sleepy Hollow 3 times before, once as a 10-year-old girl, once as an 18-year-old college student, and once as a 26-year-old professor. She had never been to Raven Rock. However, and although she had seen pictures of it online, walking towards this 65-foot-wide tomb had a worrisome effect on her senses. Each step she took seemed slower than the last, and the closer she came to it, the more she seemed to become sensitive to the movements of unseen animals prowling through the underbrush, or the unseen wind stirring in the trees. She felt as though she were driving through a city she had lived in 10 years ago, and had just passed her old house. The dizzying feeling that it would be very easy and natural for her to choose to pull over, park in the driveway, and try the handle to a door to a house where strangers lived, and who knows who was waiting for her on the inside. She left her car in the parking lot and proceeded down the trail that led to Buttermilk Hill. Things were strangely quiet, and she noticed herself becoming increasingly sensitive to the vacuum of energy in a place so drained of living activity. No insects buzzed, no squirrels barked, and no birds sang. Something had to take its place, and a curious part of her soul seemed to have its eyes wide open in nervous concentration. Even the street where her Airbnb sat was murmuring with wakening animal life when she left it. But this shadowy park in the heart of a nature reserve was reserved and watchful. With the absence of sights or sounds, she found her mind wandering in distasteful directions. She thought of her father, who had driven her across Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York to visit the site of her favorite story. Remembered his kind eyes and the subtle sadness that weighed perceptibly over him. She thought of her parents' divorce when she was little, how they assured her that she had no responsibility for the separation, but how the guilt haunted her more than any ghost. She thought of her father's own last lonely walk, how one morning he drove his car to a state park, walked down a long wooded trail, and sat on a bench looking out over the lake. And of how, as he watched the dawn gleaming in the black water, he shot himself through the head. She also thought of her mother, already dying of cancer at the same time, and how the news of his suicide robbed her of her strength. The spiral began immediately, and 3 months later, she was also dead. And this coming on the tail end of her own humiliating divorce. She thought of her ex-husband, the tidy little man with the dark beard and horn-rimmed glasses, whom she met in the gender studies class which he was teaching. He was just the GA, and only a few years older than her, but she was struck by the conviction with which he spoke about weighty matters, justice, equality, truth. After she graduated, they met for drinks, and she moved in with him 2 months later. They were only married for 2 years before he disappeared one morning with most of his belongings and no note. She eventually tracked him down at his new girlfriend's massive gated home. She was disgusted that he sent her, the tall, blonde CFO of a women's pro basketball team, outside to confront her, answer her questions, and ask her to leave while he watched mutely from the upstairs window with empty eyes. She'd felt shame burning through her whole body, for all three of them. It was still early in the morning, and although the sun was coming up through the trees, a vestigial gloom left over from the night still clung to the rock, which was silhouetted against the rosy sky in the deep purple murk. It looked like a grim, shuttered house brooding, seething, over its unspeakable history with barely suppressed rage. It was horribly quiet, yet a low-frequency energy seemed to be humming from the stony heart, pulsating angrily like the frantic, bitter breaths of a scorned woman. She was the only person in the park that morning, and every time she took a step, the crunch of leaves and gravel seemed conspicuously loud. A dank film of violet mist hovered around the monolith, shifting wakefully in the wind, and as it rolled across the rock, she thought she spotted someone lying at its base. She was suddenly aware of how alone she was. Squinting through the early morning shadows, she wondered whether she was seeing things accurately. There was something dark and still huddling in an oblong crevice in the stone. It was deep enough for a person to crawl into it and lay down to sleep. Maybe it was a homeless person, she thought. Maybe a lost child. She couldn't get a gauge on their size, gender, or age. Maybe someone who was hurt or had been hurt. Maybe badly. Maybe worse than badly. Maybe someone who was hiding on purpose, who didn't want to be found, who wanted to sleep in peace and would lash out at a vulnerable stranger with a vicious rage. She stepped closer and began to see movement. Thank God, she thought. At least they are alive. She suddenly knew that she would not be able to keep from screaming if she had found herself alone in the shadow of this rock with a corpse. But who were they? And did they need help? She could now tell they were at least 5 feet long and petite. A woman. Suddenly she was aware of the strangely sweet odor, like musk, and the faint scent of lavender. She, the other woman, seemed to be shivering terribly, rippling with subtle tremors that could barely be detected in the gloom around her. But why was she shivering? Cold? Sickness? Something worse than sickness? Terror? She wondered if she could just call someone right now, the police or the park rangers, and have them wake her up. Was she even asleep? Something pulled her on, though. And even though she began grinding her teeth and shivering herself, she couldn't help but walk towards the trembling sleeper in the rock. As she passed through the bank of mist, things began to clear. She was only a few steps away from touching her. She didn't want to reach out. Why was she shivering so much? It was a crisp morning, but not that cold. The shivers were now convulsions. Now, a shuddering fit. She reached her hand out to wake the sleeper. And then she screamed. The scream was echoed back at her. An inhuman female shriek, boiling with centuries of seething rage. An animalistic howl that bounded angrily from the house-like walls of Raven Rock. The woman on the ground was being torn to pieces. Pieces that came flying wildly at her. The shivering body was a flock of greasy ravens gorging themselves on something in the cleft. And as she reached out to them, they rushed forward, slapping her with their massive wings. She didn't realize how large ravens really were, with their wingspans the length of a man's arm, and knocking her to the ground with their stabbing beaks. The flock crashed through the trees and tore into the sky, croaking gluttonously and filling the forest with the rushing volume of their chaotic rage. She was still covering her face with her hands, shivering in a ball, when the quiet returned. She could still hear the insect-like vibrations of their rustling wings as they watched her from the trees, but she felt safe enough to look up and back away from the monolith. Pulling her hands back, she found that she had been sliced in several places, and that blood was already welling in the shallow lacerations. She couldn't stop shaking, but closed her eyes, took a stabilizing breath, and raised herself up. One raven, it seemed as large as a chicken, staring at her through a cloudy, blind eye. Still stood grimly on one of the boulders in front of her, monitoring her movements like a ghoulish sentinel. When she finally forced herself to break contact with its dead fish-like eye, she peered into the cleft of the rock and shuddered. It was full of yellow bones and pink strips of flesh of some animal. Animals! She could see that more than one skeleton was represented here, but what kind of animal was it? Although she didn't know about anatomy to guess anything about the long thigh bones and broken ribs scattered in the cleft, the reddish light was strong enough that she could see one distinguishing detail. They were scored by teeth marks. In particular, she recognized the parallel tracks of incisors, which appeared to be large and sharp, and she had the nauseating sense that she had come upon a lion's den. She caught a glimpse of something round that looked, even in the shadow, like a skull. It was notched and slashed all over with teeth marks, as if a starving man had ravenously peeled away the flesh in a fit of unquenchable hunger. Her stomach suddenly snarled loudly, and she realized that she hadn't had any breakfast. Staring at the skull, oddly round with its sockets facing forward and culminating in a square jawbone, she felt her mouth begin to water impatiently. She turned away. Walking back to the main trail, she couldn't help but notice the sign of some recent struggle. Something heavy had been dragged through the underbrush here and deposited in that cleft, because the soil was plowed up, as if by dragging heels, and the leaves and twigs pushed to either side in a jagged streak that led back into the woods in a direction far from the trail. Following it with her eyes, she watched the leaf-strewn path fade into the blackness and wondered if anything could be watching her from the shadows behind those grim, swaying trees. She stared until she thought she saw the faint gray blur of a face, gouged by two black sockets, looking back at her. But she turned back towards the trail and kept walking. The screech of ravens started to build around her as they fluttered back to their meal. Evidently, there were still lashings of flesh to be gobbled, and she quickened her pace and wondered why she had been so unsettled. She had obviously stumbled on a place where animals hid themselves when they were sick and dying. Some wounded or dying deer had dragged itself from the woods, bunkered in the cleft, died, and been consumed by the ravens. It was all very natural. What she couldn't get over, though, was the smell. It was old and musty and reeked of mold. She had taken part in several disinterments where 19th century coffins had been raised from the earth and broken open by researchers. They all had a uniquely heavy, sweet, spoiled odor, like bad milk, a reek of corpse wax, the festering molten weeping of human fat as it rotted under dead skin, and of course animal skulls aren't round. A small ancient part of her brain spoke up while the rest of it was still reeling, and it had told her to stop shuffling and to run. To run, not because she was smelling the remains that she had seen gnawed and discarded in the rock, because whatever she was smelling, with its centuries-old stench of mold and rot, might still be prowling the woods around her.
Chilling tales for dark nights.